Libertarianism represents the most uncompromising extension of classical liberal principles in modern political thought. Emerging most clearly in 20th century American political philosophy, libertarianism takes the liberal commitment to individual liberty and pushes it to its logical extreme. Where classical liberalism seeks limited government, libertarianism argues that almost all government activity beyond basic protection is illegitimate. Libertarianism is therefore best understood not as a rejection of liberalism, but as its radical purification. Historical context, a 20th century American development. While libertarian ideas draw heavily on earlier liberal thinkers such as John Locke and Adam Smith, libertarianism as a coherent political ideology crystallized in the United States during the mid to late 20th century. It arose largely in reaction to the expansion of the welfare state, New Deal liberalism, and later the regulatory growth of the post-war federal government. Cold War anxieties about socialism, central planning, and bureaucratic power provided fertile ground for libertarian arguments. In this environment, libertarian thinkers framed state expansion not merely as inefficient, but as morally illegitimate. The minimal state, the night watchman state. At the heart of libertarian political theory is the concept of the minimal state, often described as a night watchman state. Under this model, the only legitimate functions of government are protection against external threats, national defense, protection against internal threats, police, enforcement of contracts and property rights, courts. All other functions, education, healthcare, welfare, infrastructure, cultural funding, and economic regulation, are viewed as unjustified intrusions into individual liberty. The state does not exist to promote virtue, equality, welfare, or social outcomes. Its sole legitimate purpose is to prevent force, theft, and fraud. Absolute core principles. Libertarianism rests on a tightly interlocking set of moral commitments. 1. Property rights. Property rights are treated as foundational and inviolable. Individuals are entitled to the fruits of their labor and to dispose of their property as they see fit. Property is not merely an economic tool, but an extension of personal autonomy. Interference with property through taxation, regulation, or redistribution is therefore understood as interference with the individual themselves. 2. Voluntary consent. All legitimate social relations must be voluntary. Markets, contracts, labor arrangements, and even charity are morally valid only when entered into freely. Any arrangement imposed without consent, regardless of its social benefit, is considered morally suspect. This applies not only to private actors, but especially to the state. 3. The non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle holds that the initiation of force is always wrong. Force is morally permissible only in self-defense or in defense of property. Because the state ultimately enforces its policies through coercion, libertarians scrutinize all government action through this lens. If a policy requires force against peaceful individuals, it is presumptively illegitimate. Opposition to the welfare state. Libertarianism is sharply opposed to the welfare state and to redistributive policies of any kind. Welfare programs, public health care, unemployment benefits, and subsidized education are rejected not primarily on efficiency grounds, but on moral grounds. From a libertarian perspective, welfare programs require compulsory taxation. Taxation is enforced through coercion. Coercive redistribution violates property rights. Therefore, welfare is morally unjust, even if socially beneficial. Charity is praised when voluntary, but condemned when compulsory. Social justice, in this view, is not a collective obligation, but a matter of individual choice. Redistributive taxation as moral wrong. Libertarians draw a stark moral line regarding taxation. While minimal taxation to fund police, courts, and defense may be tolerated, redistributive taxation is rejected outright. Redistribution is seen not as sharing, but as forced transfer. Because individuals are compelled to surrender earnings under threat of legal punishment, libertarians argue that redistributive taxation amounts to partial ownership of one person by another. This leads to one of libertarianism's most provocative claims. Coercive redistribution is morally equivalent to servitude. Key thinkers. Robert Nozick's Anarchy, State, and Utopia, 1974, is the most systematic philosophical defense of libertarianism. Nozick argues that individuals possess absolute rights that function as side constraints on what others, including the state, may do to them. Nozick famously rejects pattern theories of justice, arguing that any attempt to enforce equality or fairness over time necessarily violates individual liberty. If holdings were acquired justly, then any redistribution, no matter how noble its aim, is unjust. For Nozick, the minimal state is the most extensive state that can be morally justified. Anything beyond it violates individual rights. Ayn Rand popularized libertarian ideas through novels such as Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead. Although not an academic political theorist, Rand's influence on American libertarian culture is profound. Rand's philosophy of objectivism celebrates rational self-interest and condemns altruism when enforced by the state. She portrays welfare states as systems that punish productivity and reward dependency. In Rand's view, compelling individuals to support others through taxation is a moral inversion, turning virtue into vice and vice into virtue. Libertarianism in perspective. Libertarianism shares liberalism's commitment to liberty and rights, but diverges sharply from modern liberalism and social democracy. Where modern liberals argue that the state must actively enable freedom through social programs, libertarians insist that freedom consists solely in non-interference. Critics argue that libertarianism ignores structural inequality, power imbalances, and the social conditions necessary for meaningful choice. Supporters respond that any attempt to correct those conditions through coercion destroys freedom itself. As a result, libertarianism remains one of the most internally consistent and most controversial ideological traditions in modern political thought.